Welcome, everyone. We'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. All right, we're going to get started in 30 seconds. Okay. Welcome, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Kim. I am the Intelligence Director for Transformers Foundation, which represents or strives to put forward the unified perspective of the denim supply chain on its ideas for positive change in the sector. And I'm going to be hosting and moderating today. And before we get into things, a little bit of housekeeping. There is a Q&A box, which you are welcome to put your questions in to as we go along, and we'll come to them at the end. But if they're particularly relevant, or if there's an opportunity to answer it as we go, we will try to do that, whether verbally or in writing. We'll see. Depends on the nature of the question and whether it makes sense to whether we can fit it in as we go or keep it to the end. But I do encourage you to use it as a stream of consciousness. Put your questions in as they pop into your head. Rubia, could you go to the next slide, please? So I can introduce everyone. So just a few short words about today's session and also the report. The resource is a supplier-led resource, which I think is really important to emphasize and stress, because there aren't very many examples of suppliers in the apparel supply chain coming together to sort of work collectively on a shared issue. And I think from a symbolic perspective, this is a really powerful example of what's possible when that happens. And specifically, it was commissioned and led by Crystal Group. And from Crystal Group, we have Kyle, if you just wave and say hello, and also Cami here with us today. Diamond Fabrics Limited, which is part of Supplier Group and also one of the founders of Transformers Foundation. Lensing, and from Lensing, we don't have any representatives today, but they're here in spirit. Pactics Group, which is represented by Linda. If you could just wave and say hello, Linda, thank you. Poetic Gem, which is part of PDS Group. Kavita, if you could just wave and say hello. And Shahi, we have from Shahi, we have Gori on the line. And Simple Approach, which is also PDS Group, which is not represented today, but with us in spirit. Sorcery, Ruchita, if you could just wave. And Sorcery is an interesting addition to the group because they work very closely with a lot of cotton farmers, which of course is also part of the value chain. And it was also, this report was supported by Transformers Foundation, that's I already introduced, and GIZ Fabric, which is a project of GIZ Fabric Asia. And from GIZ Fabric Asia, I believe we have Zarmina on the line. And I should also point out that we have Jessie Lee on the line, and Jessie Lee was the project manager for this report, and without her, we wouldn't be here today. So the report was written by the Remedy Project, who is not on the line. And the reason for that is because the intention today is really to give a high-level overview of what the report is, why it was commissioned, how we hope suppliers will use it. It is not a deep dive into specific pieces of legislation, but we will be doing that. We have a webinar series planned starting from September next month that is in partnership with the Remedy Project, where we will be looking specifically at different pieces of legislation and how they may impact commercial actors in the value chain, in the supply chain rather. There's a link in the chat if you'd like to register for that, for the first of that webinar series. So each one will focus on a specific piece of legislation. And the Remedy Project is an entity, a nonprofit that works with governments, civil societies, law enforcement, and the private sector to translate the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into practice. And they really are lawyers. That is their expertise. Many of them are ex-corporate lawyers, so they're very well positioned to not only write this report, but also to do these webinar deep dives that I just mentioned. And the final thing I will say before handing it over to everybody else who has much more interesting stuff to say is that we prepared the slides for this webinar collectively. And so the slides that are being presented here today, of course, will be presented by individuals, but they are, the content on those slides really is a representative of the group as a whole. They've been, the talking points have been discussed, the content of the slides have been discussed. And the fact that it's one person who's presenting it doesn't mean that it reflects only their point of view or position. So Rubia, if you could go to the next slide. And with that, I will hand over to Ruchi. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. And it's great to see so many people join us and finding themselves interested on what these legislations and updates are bringing in for us in the future. Now, as the fiber and textile sector continues to transition from voluntary-driven sustainability schemes that were largely driven by brands and multi-stakeholder initiatives to now regulatory-driven sustainability and chain of custody schemes, it is important that suppliers understand the existing and emerging legislation and the profound impacts it will have on their business and the future of sustainability reporting, plus the due diligence in our sector. Now, as the brands begin to respond to this legislation, a clear shift we see is underway that places greater responsibility on the suppliers to meet the requirements of the legislation. It is fast becoming a prerequisite for doing business, ensuring that all facilities, all employees, all products, and transactions from fiber to finished goods across the whole supply chain are more transparent and traceable and deliver more meaningful, measurable, and equitable social and environmental impact. Among most suppliers we have been engaging with, we see there is a lot of uncertainty and more questions than answers on how to move forward now. And as a first of its kind report, we aim to provide suppliers with a single trusted resource to understand the legislation and take practical steps to move forward from here and find their way forward, find their answers through these reports together to ensure compliance in their own business as well as in the businesses of their vendors and their clients. And hence, the leading organizations present here today have joined forces to develop this valuable resource, which explains how the suppliers now need to collaborate in ways that do not yet exist, sharing knowledge, resources, and investing together in the future of our sector. Next slide, please. This most recent report builds on the 12 legislative initiatives found in the 2023 report and adds 3 new initiatives that were not previously included. And the first one being EU Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles, ESSCT, which aims to define circularity in a more practical way when it comes to extended use and reuse, repair, and recyclability of the products. This strategy seeks to create greener and fairer global supply chain, affecting both EU-based companies and their international suppliers. Now, key actions here include setting design standards, improving product information availability, reducing overproduction, and enforcing extended producer responsibility. Now, what does this mean for suppliers? This means stricter environmental compliance, innovation with eco-friendly material, greater transparency about material origins and production impacts too. They will also be required to adopt circular economy practices across their supply chain, focusing on product reuse and recycling. The next one is German Due Diligence and Supply Chain Act, which today may be the most rigorous legislation and might serve as a preview of what may be required across the EU and perhaps globally in the future. This act imposes strict human rights and environmental standards on organizations operating in Germany and their global supply chain. And to mitigate risks, suppliers should proactively assess their operations, develop robust compliance frameworks, establish procedures, and invest in training of their staff, plus engage in open dialogues with their clients. There is also a need to enhance transparency, conduct thorough risk assessments, and maintain detailed records. Plus, they are also now required to establish grievance mechanism and be prepared for increased scrutiny because non-compliance can lead to significant fines and reputational damage. Remember, the Act's impact extends beyond Germany, affecting global supply chains. And finally, a new section that is close to our hearts at Sorcery, where our sector can take learnings from other sectors under EU Directive 2019-633 on protecting farmers and smaller suppliers from unfair trading practices in agriculture and food supply chains. This includes defining and banning harmful practices, empowering suppliers to negotiate fair deals, and increasing transparency in the industry. The directive also establishes a framework for enforcement and compliant mechanisms. While enforcement is still in early stages, this is a significant step towards a fairer and more balanced marketplace. And these principles are also so relevant to garment industry, highlighting the need for fair practices and responsible purchasing in fashion. And at Sorcery, I must tell you, it's our mission to transform trade for good. And together with our partners, we are turning ambition into action through our programs, which are trading methodologies and sourcing solutions that enable transparent, fair, and efficient transactions from grower to consumers. That's all from me. Thank you, Kim. Back to you.
I'm going to hand over to Linda, who's going to take us through a little bit more information about which legislation is included and also how to use the resource.
Thank you, Kim. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. So I will explain indeed which legislation is included and why. As already mentioned, last year we had 12 legislation explained, and all 12 are updated. Some have minor updates and some have major updates. And based on the suppliers and the recommendations from the Remedy project, we choose these fact sheets. Many of these laws have global applications and will impact suppliers all over the world, directly or indirectly. And we state that complying with the highest international standards could help become or remain a future-proof business. And besides the 12 legislations from last year that are updated, we have 3 new fact sheets. So you see this overview at the right side of the slide. The new fact sheets are the European Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles. This is actually not a legislation itself. It's more the backbone behind much new legislation in the EU. So that's why we call this fact sheet 0. You can actually see it like this. The EU has the European Green Deal, which is the overarching plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And under the EU Green Deal are also sector-specific initiatives, such as the European Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles. We highlight the Strategy for Sustainable and Circular Textiles to give a better understanding of the structure of legislations and directive in the EU textile sector. Then the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act is added because this is a legislation focused on social and environmental performances in the supply chain. So this is important legislations for manufacturer and other suppliers in the industry. And it's also connected to the CSDDD, but we will talk about that in a minute. And then the last one, unfair trading practices in the horticultural and food supply chain, legislation from another sector. Yeah, as already mentioned, we can learn from other sectors as well. That's why we add this one this year. So in short, there are 15 fact sheets this year about existing and coming sustainable legislation across the EU, the US, and the UK that will affect the textile industry and therefore directly or indirectly suppliers. There's one thing I would like to emphasize. There are more legislation than these 14 fact sheets or 15 fact sheets. So we encourage you to look into coming legislation or ask your clients or customers which legislation is or will become important for them, so you can prepare for that. And then now I would like to go to the next slide to explain how to use this research. Okay. So let's first have a look at the structure of the report. After the introduction, it is explained how to use this document, and every fact sheet covers the following topics: key changes, overview, context, status, scope, obligations, compliance, recommendations, potential implications, penalties, form of enforcement, reporting of their disclosure for companies, access to remedy mechanism, opportunity to participate in legislative development, and useful resources. And you can see if a legislation is updated if you see the orange button with update, and if the text is marked yellow. So it is very clear in the report which part is updated and which one is stayed the same. Then now I would like to explain how to use this document by using one of the fact sheets. So we can go to the next slide, please. The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Number 1 is the key updates. Here we mostly mention that most important updates are the thresholds to be a company in scope for this particular legislation. And then number 2, 3, and 4 are the overview, context, and status. So the CSDDD requires some companies inside and outside of the EU to undertake due diligence on their environmental and human rights impacts and create a plan to mitigate. In other words, companies become more accountable for their social and environmental impacts, both in their own operation and throughout the value chain. The CSDDD is adopted and approved. Now the EU countries have 2 years to translate the CSDDD into national law. So that's number 1 till 4. Then 5 is the scope. Given time, I will discuss this quickly. You can find an overview in the report, to which companies this legislation applies, for both companies inside the EU and outside the EU. And also when you have to comply. So some companies have to apply after 3 years, some 4 or 5. So you can have there's an overview in the report. Then number 6, the obligations for companies in scopes. This section provides a list with the obligations for the companies in scope. Do I still have some time to discuss that, or? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so first of all, integrate due diligence into relevant policies, develop risk management system, and set up due diligence policy. Then second, identify, assess, and prioritize actual and adverse impacts from their business operations. They also have to take measures to prevent or mitigate impact, for example, by implementing corrective action plan, provide remediation of actual impacts. Then the companies in scope also have to engage with stakeholders. So they are required to consult stakeholders. Establish a notification mechanism and compliant procedure for different stakeholders, such as workers and civil society. And the last one is they have to conduct annual monitoring, such as reviewing policies and actions to reach targets. So just to be clear, these obligations are for companies in scope, like brands or retailers. Then the remedy we also selected some compliance recommendations for the companies in scope. That's number 7. That's the comprehensive evaluation of supply chain and development of a governance and compliance framework. So think about reviewing current procedures and policies to comply with the CSDDD. Now you probably wonder what the effect is for the suppliers. So that's actually number 8 in every chapter. That's the potential implications for suppliers to companies in scope. And here we provide you with a list what suppliers can expect. So as a supplier, you should be prepared to comply with your customers' code of conduct. Additionally, it is expected that the current standards in the code of conduct become more stricter. Furthermore, suppliers can expect audits from customers. Customers will also request other internal, social, and environmental data, such as information about the workforce, working hours, maybe material traceability, supply chain mapping, etc. And as a supplier, you can prepare yourself by collecting data already or set up a system to collect data. Lastly, suppliers can expect that the compliant procedure becomes stricter too. And then number 9 till 13, giving the time, I would like you to read it by yourself, but this one is very small. These are the penalties, force of enforcement, reporting, and in short, I can tell penalties for non-compliance can differ per country. And for the reporting requirements, it's best to look at the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And in the last chapter, so number 14, you can find useful resources for this fact sheet if you want to know more. Okay, I can give the floor to the next one.
Thank you. As it's clear from the introductions that most of these legislations will have a very far-reaching impact, particularly on suppliers. So when we went through all the 15 fact sheets as the group of suppliers working on this report, what we did was we read through all the fact sheets, the implications for suppliers, and try to consolidate some key trends, implications for suppliers that we observe, and put down our thoughts and recommendations for suppliers. So these were crowdsourced and collectively put together. And this is available in our executive summary of the report as well. And it's a very handy resource just to understand what's coming for suppliers. So I will try my best to summarize what we put together. There are 4 trends in total across these 2 slides. So the first trend that we observed was positive and sort of indicative of a shift within the industry that towards responsible purchasing practices and shared responsibility. So in the EU CSDD, which Linda just talked about, they introduced a requirement for brands to review their purchasing practices, particularly when contracting with small and medium enterprises. So that indicates that maybe CSDD is trying to foster more balanced trading relationships. So brands' purchasing practices, as we all know, do influence practices in the supply chain, both on social and environmental sustainability. So this shift indicates that maybe brands' purchasing practices can also be factored into risk assessment. And brands may also have to report on their purchasing practices, similar to how suppliers have to report on their human rights and environmental practices. So here, our reflection and recommendation for suppliers is to leverage this to advocate for ethical commercial practices, be open to demanding fairer contracts, and also collectively coming together as a group of suppliers to advocate for brands disclosing purchasing practices, and also for legislators to include purchasing practices in upcoming legislations. And that's why we have mentioned the unfair trading practices legislation in the agriculture sector, because that's a very good example of what could come for the fashion industry in the future. So it's a very interesting read, and we do encourage reading that as well. The second trend that we observed across all legislations is there is a high possibility that there would still be multiple interpretations of these legislations by brands, but also EU member states. And what we believe that could lead to is each brand operationalizing these legislations in their own way, which could lead to suppliers having to comply with multiple conflicting standards. I think we're all experiencing it already. Multiple audit standards, multiple traceability pilots, tools, third-party grievance tools. It's all a reaction to these multiple legislations coming and each brand interpreting them in their own way. Similarly, with EU member states, in case of directives like the CSDD, once the member states start adopting these directives, they all also may interpret it differently. So that could also impact us by leading to multiple due diligence processes. Here, our recommendation and reflection for suppliers is that given that in the last year, so many legislative changes have happened already, so many adoptions have happened, that it's the right time to engage with brands and retailers and ask them proactively how are they going to change their practices, their implementation methodologies to comply with these legislations. At minimum, suppliers are encouraged to comply with the OECD due diligence guidelines or the UN guiding principles, because most of the legislations are underpinned by these 2 guidelines and principles. What suppliers can prepare for is, given that there are some remedy requirements in these regulations, suppliers can expect that brands will request adoption of third-party grievance mechanisms because there may be a perception that suppliers' own grievance mechanisms are not adequate. So this is something that we're already experiencing, but can be prepared for in the future as well. We also anticipate a greater effort on part of industry bodies that represent both buyers and suppliers to try to drive commonality in audit requirements. And also we hope that suppliers and these industry bodies continue to advocate for harmonization across EU member states as they adopt directives. So, for example, in March 2024, the European Council and the European Parliament reached a political agreement that if CSDD is adopted, which it was, that the German Supply Chain Act will be harmonized with CSDD. So this gives us hope that in the future also EU member states will collaborate with each other. And this is something that we hope industry bodies continue to advocate for to reduce the duplication burden on suppliers. Next slide. The third trend is similar to the duplication of work because all of this means increasing reporting requirements and data requests for suppliers. Particularly, like I was mentioning in the past few months, the adoption of CSDD, EU Forced Labor Act, ESPR. Suppliers are facing increasing reporting requirements and data requests, including, visibility into suppliers, supply chain practices, full supply chain traceability. Brands may also, because of ESPR, they may also alter their raw material purchasing behavior and become more involved in textile processing to improve sustainability metrics, even in tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4. So given this trend, we recommend that suppliers map their supply chain to the best of their abilities and ensure that they have documentation in place as per the UFLPA and EU forced labor guidelines so that they are prepared for brand requests and also potential random detentions by customs authorities. Second, we recommend that suppliers allocate sufficient resources to understanding legislations. We obviously recognize that already there's a lot of burden on suppliers, but the legislation is coming. So if we can shift internal compliance mindset towards due diligence, and ESG teams can engage, educate, legal, HR, sourcing, and various operational functions to share the responsibility of complying with these legislations. Third, we recommend a stronger data gathering and management capacity, including systems to measure and capture life cycle assessment. So capturing energy, water, chemical data by product, and to digitize this data gathering where possible to avoid a massive administrative burden that we foresee is coming. The last trend is potential legal implications for suppliers. Already with German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, UFLPA, EUFLA, there are potential legal implications directly for suppliers. And where suppliers are not legally liable, it is possible that customers or brands might seek to transfer this liability through contractual documents to their suppliers. So here we recommend that suppliers, again, we understand and recognize there are limited resources, but wherever possible to seek competent legal advisors to advise them in case of any legal implications. Just as an example, in the German Act, NGOs and trade unions are allowed to sue on behalf of affected individuals, which could mean action against suppliers if they are perceived to be contributing to any brand's non-compliance. Second, like I mentioned earlier, being prepared to offer documents as per UFLPA and EUFLA, along with a strong mapping of due diligence practices, would be helpful in case there are such data requests by brands or customs authorities, and also being prepared to push back on any fines or penalties which are being offloaded by brands onto their supply chain in an unfair manner. So these are sort of our 4 observations and recommendations from the group. after reading all the 15 legislations. And like I said earlier, you can also find this in our executive summary.
Thank you, Gauri. And with that, I hand over to Kyle and Ruby. I ask you to go to the next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Gauri and Kim. And before the Q&A session, I would like to outline the call to action for legislators. We believe that legislation is required to create a level playing field and drive companies across the value chain to make changes. Suppliers look for a just transition, but based on shared responsibility. As legislations gain more momentum, we call for enforcement and further development of legislation in an informed manner. First of all, to move away from a top-down approach while the legislations are relied on currently. This induces significant hidden work of suppliers who in most cases already disproportionately bear the burden of sustainability or due diligence relative to their margins. And second, to involve production experts like in suppliers in the legislative development. This is to ensure adequate supplier voices are heard. We believe that involving suppliers enables better informed, more equitable, and more impactful outcomes, as well as buy-in from the start. Lastly, is about our concerns on problem shifting. We worry that the legislation covered in this guide will shift the legal responsibility from brands to suppliers, instead of sparking effective and collective actions and shared responsibilities. And I think this concludes my short part. So over to you, please, Kim.
Thank you, Kyle. Ruby, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So before we get to the Q&A, I want to bring your attention to a couple of things. First of all, there was a question in the chat about downloading the report. So we put the link about how to download that. It's available on both the Transformers Foundation website and the Asia Garment Hub website, which is supported by GIZ Fabric. But we've also put a QR code here if you want to download it. The other thing is that, as was mentioned during this presentation, this is the second iteration of this report. The first was launched almost exactly a year ago and was supported by some of the same entities that are here with us today and also some other additional ones. And we're always looking for whether it's companies or funders or whomever it might be that might be interested in supporting future versions or iterations of this report to get your contact information. Because the legislative landscape is continuously evolving, we've issued this update now, but by next year it will be in need of another update. And also, as Linda mentioned, there's when we were originally starting on this report, we mapped over 60 different pieces of legislation that could have impact or be relevant for suppliers. And so although this one covers 15 pieces of legislation, there is certainly room to look at more. And there was also a question in the Q&A about actually whether there was a publicly available list of the legislation that we had mapped when we were first embarking on this project. And there I would ask Rubia, I shared the link, if Rubia could share the link in the chat. What we did actually in 2023, so a year ago, was we crowdsourced a list of all the legislation and we put it out to all of our networks and we asked, like, if you know of any legislation that's coming that might affect our sector, could you please add it to this list? So it was a very much a collective effort. I don't know, and that was kind of our starting point. And then we looked at it together with the Remedy Project to try and figure out which ones might make sense to focus on. So it's probably also not comprehensive and probably also missing. So though we mapped over 60, I'm sure there's more, but that was the result of our crowdsourcing effort. Then I'm going to, those are the two QR codes on the screen. And then the last thing that I want to repeat for anybody who maybe missed it at the beginning is that, today's session was very much a high-level overview of what this report is, why we did it, how to use it, what are sort of the key findings or the trends that we found. It wasn't a deep dive into specific pieces of legislation, but we will be doing that. We have a webinar series planned that starts in September looking at specific pieces of legislation, and that will be done in partnership with the Remedy Project, who are the lawyers who wrote the report. And so if you'd like to register for those webinars, Rubia has also put the link to that registration page in the chat. So 3 things to look at: the download to see the actual report, the QR code to indicate if you'd like to support potentially future fact sheets, and the registration link to the upcoming deep dives that are going to look at specific pieces of legislation, the first one of which is in September. So with that, there are a few questions in the chat, and I'm going to come to that, but and Ruby, if you could go to the next, actually, why don't you leave everybody knows it's question time. Let's leave the QR codes up so that in case anybody missed it. So if you have questions, I invite you to put them in the Q&A. We'll be coming to the ones that are already there. But as sort of a transition to the Q&A, I'd like to ask the panelists, from your perspective, what do you hope or think or wish that suppliers might do after reading this report or reading specific fact sheets? And how do you hope it will be useful for them? And maybe start with Ruchita and then hand over to Gauri, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Right. Thanks, Kim. I think after reading this report or even discussing some of these with our suppliers while we were, in the middle of collating information and collating feedback from our side of the suppliers to be able to contribute for this report, I understand that the first thing all suppliers need to go back and do is map their supply chain, because there are a few handful of suppliers who have that kind of outreach, that kind of visibility of their product from the final product down till the original source. So unless you know your suppliers and their contractors and subcontractors, we can't measure what we can't see. So first we need to see where we are, where our suppliers are, where their contractors and subcontractors are. And then we need to do thorough assessments, and then work upon, identifying the loopholes and putting processes in place, processes like we just talked about, robust compliance processes, robust protocols and procedures for the employees, investing in training for the staff, maintaining detailed records, and establish mechanisms required according to the legislations, and prepare for increased scrutiny. So those are the first steps I suggest. And even at Sourcery, this is the starting point we offer to the industry, is supply chain mapping and taking support from the current trending tools around traceability and transparency, but of course in compliance with the legislation requirements. Yeah. Gauri, would you like to add?
Yeah, I think similar. I would just say that going through the executive summary, like I said, and section 8 of the fact sheets, if the whole report is really overwhelming, then just seeing those sections, absorbing what each legislation means for suppliers, and facilitating, internal brainstorm and discussion with different department heads. Like, what does each legislation mean for them? What policy shifts, system shifts do they want to do? Because I don't think any one team or department can handle the what's coming with all the legislation. So the individual owners of each department need to be aware what is coming for their particular area of work, and they need to figure out how their policy systems need to change in accordance with these legislations. So hopefully we've simplified that through the report, just the key takeaways for how it impacts different suppliers. And secondly, generally, I hope that this will spark more collaboration and dialogue within suppliers as well. A lot of times, all suppliers are trying to implement the same traceability solutions or due diligence solutions, but there's not enough collaboration or discussion around how we can learn from each other. So hopefully through Transformers and Asia Garment Hub, we can continue having those dialogues, but also suppliers feel more empowered and knowledgeable to have informed discussions with their customers. Because unless we are informed on what's coming, how it impacts us, we can't have a conversation with our brands to convey that to our customers as to how all the legislations and duplicative efforts are affecting us.
Thank you, Gauri. I want to move, there's a question in the Q&A. There's a couple of questions around materials, which we'll come to. But I actually want to start with the question from Ashita, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. She says she's from the Accountability Council in the US and wanted to ask, what do you think are real efforts to practically counter supplier level complaints that these legislations are impacting them negatively? And I'm going to open it up to all of the panelists to respond to it, but I'll just kick off by saying that, you know, my personal point of view on this question is that the root cause of a lot of the undesirable things and impacts that happen in the supply chain, whether it's around environment or whether it's around social issues and beyond, that the root cause of many of those things is inequity between value chain actors and groups in the value chain. And the legislation, in my view, is not doing enough to address that inequity. If anything, we are actually doing is making it worse, right? We're giving the brands and the retailers who already have more power in this picture even more of it. So, but that is my personal point of view, and that I would love to see legislation that is really trying to tackle inequity between value chain groups. And a practical example of, you know, how that could be done. For instance, there are a lot of pieces of legislation looking at climate action and how to ensure, and are doing so by, for example, requiring targets around decarbonization. But a different way to approach that same issue, for instance, would be to require disclosure from brands and retailers on the percentage of their revenue that they are investing in their supply chains to support decarbonization. But that is my own personal perspective. Does anybody else in this group want to add or have anything that you want to say on that question?
Yeah, I'd like to second that a point that you made just now. And, you know, it's about what are the brands doing to financially support, and also with their flexibility to support their supply chain. But then as we go down the chain, as suppliers, we also have supply chain beyond us. You know, as if you're a manufacturer, you're a weaver, knitter, you're a spinner. So I think that responsibility falls on each one of us in the supply chain. And I think it's a shared responsibility also, something that the brands and retailers, I think, need to really take on board, you know, and what is this support that they're going to give their supply chain. So I think that is really important. And I think collectives like ours, which is probably one of the first, are going to encourage, hopefully, more collaborative. It's not a us versus them approach. It's a collaborative approach where we are trying to get the suppliers, the manufacturers of the Global South and other regions a seat at the table, a voice. You know? So, yeah.
Thank you, Kavita. Is there anybody else who would like to speak on Ishita's question?
I'll just add, because we were also asked this question when we did a press conference, and it does come up because we've published this paper I mean, I guess the question is like, what next, or like, how do we actually influence legislation? It's really tough, I think, for suppliers because, yeah, like Kavita already said, we're not in the location where these legislations are made, where, a lot of suppliers are in the global south. And also we don't have dedicated teams, legal teams, specialized teams working on specific legislations, policy teams, etc. To be able to take that time, effort, and that exact articulation that's needed to be able to kind of communicate with legislators. Um, also, till now, I think that space maybe for suppliers wasn't there, but as that's created, even we would really look forward to see how can we all collaborate and communicate better with policymakers, um, or have a better position or more inclusion in multi-stakeholder groups, which are consulted by legislators as well. So it's an open question for us also. We're keen to see how suppliers can have more share of voice in how legislations are created.
There's a related question which we're already sort of touching on from Marina, so I'm going to just put it explicitly on the table. Marina from Policy Hub for circularity for apparel and footwear, and her question is, we are currently engaging with policymakers and working to ensure the realities of the entire textile value chain are well reflected in these guidelines. Sorry, I didn't read the first part of the question, which says that there's a lot of upcoming work on defining the guidelines for implementing these various pieces of legislation at the EU level. And so I am going to infer the question. I apologize, Marina, if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think the question is around how do we make sure and how do we most effectively ensure that all the perspectives of the value chain are represented. And here too, I'll just maybe share a couple of reflections, from my perspective before I open it up to the floor. But I was involved in last year's report as well, which launched in July 2023. And it's been really interesting because as a result of that report, Transformers Foundation, or the Asia Garment Hub, or I myself personally, I am a former garment factory manager, have a lot of connections to the supply chain. And what I've sort of observed happening in the last year is I have a lot of people working in the policy space coming to me saying, hey, we would like to talk to suppliers. We'd like to include suppliers. Can you please help us to make this happen? And then at the same time, I have a lot of suppliers coming and saying, hey, we would really like to be involved in this space. How do we do that? And as a foundation that works closely with the denim supply chain, or as a human who has networks of people, what I can do in those situations is I can introduce individuals. So I can introduce a policymaker to a supplier or vice versa, but there's really an infrastructural gap here and I think that the reason I share this is because I think it speaks to the infrastructural gap that needs to be filled to sort of systematically ensure that these perspectives are included. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how to do that effectively, because I also, like I said, I'm an ex-factory manager. The policy space is not really my bread and butter either. And so I would really invite the people who know the policy space, who understand how this legislative landscape works, to understand people that understand how these guidelines are going to be developed, to sort of think with us as to how we might create those create that infrastructure so that we can go beyond just sort of connecting relevant individuals. Does anybody else have anything that they want to say on that question? No? Okay. Then there's a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to keep up. Okay, there's a couple of questions about materials and, the legislation sort of favoring one type of material versus another. I don't know if there's anything, if any of the panelists want to address that question or some of those questions as a group or not. pause there to give you a chance to respond. Or yeah.
So I wanted to add that, I mean, I'm going to have to read the legislations thoroughly myself. I've only read parts of the report yet, but because we were focused on certain parts. But I see there's a lot of requirement for increased transparency. The suppliers are now expected to declare verified impact of their product and the product processes throughout the supply chain. So I think that's, the important bit has been covered once the claims are out, how much this production or this product is impacting the environment, then it will automatically drive, the direction towards natural fibers or natural material, because there will be, I mean, it's already out there that the synthetics or the artificial fibers are creating havocs in the industry. And there is the microplastic policy coming too. So I see that indirectly this has been covered, but I am also yet to read the whole legislation or the whole report thoroughly to understand if natural fibers have been directly mentioned as a, as a recommendation over the synthetic ones. But indirectly I see there are ways where the ways through which this direction will automatically happen.
Thank you, Ruchita. Is there anybody else who wants to take on? There's a question. There's a couple of questions from Bill around materials and man-made fibers, derived from fossil fuels versus natural fibers. And there's another question, I believe, from I lost it, sorry. There were a couple of questions around this and the point of view on that. Does anybody have anything else they want to say on that?
So I was looking at Bill's question about the legislation, if I understand it correctly, do they contribute towards or away from, in a way, use of biodegradable materials? Do they encourage it? And I think the EU guidelines on circularity on across the EU Green Deal, it is not only focusing on the carbon emissions, it does focus a lot on your end of life circularity, biodegradability, yes, and also end of life use, longevity, durability, etc. So yes, it does. The legislations do encourage use of better materials and processes, and also looking at end-of-life processes. So it's not just about the material you're using and what is the carbon impact of it, because plastics can actually show a lower greenhouse gas emission than some cellulosics can. But what is the entire life cycle? So that's where earlier we had mentioned, one of the panelists was talking about the LCAs. So understanding of the LCAs, I think Gauri was talking about it, becomes really important as well. Understanding your product, right, from its impacts to source to end of use and disposal as well.
Thank you. And I would just reiterate too that from a process perspective, I think the point of inclusion and who's included in creating this legislation is actually an important part of, or sort of an important context for some of these questions. Okay, there is a question, let's see. How to include micro and small enterprises in this initiative? And I want to get your thoughts on this, because I think in many ways, one of the reasons we came together to even create this report in the first place speaks to this gap. Is there anybody who would like to answer the question from Naresh, how to include micro and small enterprises in this initiative? And by this initiative, I think what I'm interpreting is, in sort of the legislative space, or how to engage in these fact sheets.
I think the model remains more or less very clear for all sizes of organizations. And the first thing will be to map supply chain and assess your existing processes and understand the loopholes, understand where it's not falling in place with the requirements. And that's a starting point for any big or small enterprise, I believe. Even small and micro processes will be required to report into the bigger, the supply chains. They are a part of the supply chain. They are contributing to the process. So this is going to be the starting point for everyone to identify their suppliers and their processes, and understand their existing processes and match it to what is required. They will also be asked to report by their buyers. I mean, now their buyers would be spinners or bigger organizations or retailers. They will also be required to follow the process. And the first thing is to map your own supply chain and assess. Yeah.
Thank you, Ruchita. I think the only thing I would add to that question is that, sort of working collectively on this is also a way to alleviate the burden. For example, coming together to commission resources like this one, instead of each company going out and hiring their own consultant to basically do this work. And that's why I think it's really a credit and a testament to the companies that have helped support this initiative, because what they're doing is they're doing their work in a way that the public can also benefit from and that can support others. And so I would really like to encourage also the larger players in this space who might have the resources to be able to do that, as well as the smaller ones, to really come together and look at how can we work smarter to address these challenges that are all shared. We're low on time. There are still more questions coming in. If you have to drop off now, I would just say thank you for joining us, for being here with us this morning. Please come back for our deep dives into specific pieces of legislation. Download the report, look at the fact sheets that are of interest to you, and we really appreciate your support. For those of you who are able to stay on another 10 minutes, we will maybe try and tackle 1 or let's say 5 minutes, 1 or 2 more questions. There is a question in the chat about here from oh, sorry, it keeps moving around. Oh, I think it just got moved to answered, but I actually wanted to answer.
Oh, is it the one that I just answered? Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Here, exactly, Gauri. So there's a question from Sashinta. I apologize, I'm surely mispronouncing, but the question is, in my view, collecting documentation on each purchase order in case of a detention is a huge waste of resources. Instead, carrying out a risk assessment of the supply chain and carrying out spot audits to confirm supply chain accuracy would be a better approach. What are your thoughts on this evidence collection approach, and which legislations are now requiring? So Gauri, you put an answer to this. I'm going to invite you to share it, and if anybody else wants to add, most welcome.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Of course, it's a lot of effort. Agree that, at the end of the day, it's more important to strengthen risk assessment, due diligence processes, ensuring internal teams are trained on this whole process, spot audits. All of this is a better approach, and it's a systematic approach. Data collection for POs is just a requirement for UFLPA, EU forced labor, in case there are detentions. And also there are brands. I'm sure many of the suppliers would agree that there are requests from brands for complete supply chain traceability of all POs or a selection of POs, in which case we do have to collect the documentation. So I do think that this is inevitable going forward, given where the legislation is going and how brands are adapting their practices. But like I said, building better management systems is obviously the first and most important step. So here I would recommend referring to an initiative called Yarn Ethically and Sustainably Sourced. Yes, initiative that we've been a part of that's really helped us understand how to build better due diligence systems in order to be compliant with these legislations. I can share the link in the chat.
Thank you, Gauri. All right, we're already 5 minutes over time, so I am going to close this session, but if your question has gone unanswered, we'll do our best to to reach out to you with an answer if we have a point of view on it. But I want to thank you again for coming today, for sharing your time, for supporting the resource. And I want to thank all of the speakers here today for being willing to share your points of view and your thoughts in front of a group. I know it's not always easy. And also for all of your work over the last 6 months on getting this resource together, because it was a heavy lift. So we hope that everybody will benefit from that effort and that work. So with that, I am going to close this session and wish you all a very good day.